Hey guys, tonight we're wading into something that sounds like it was invented by a bored chemistry professor with a grudge and absolutely zero interest in your well-being. The world of research chemicals, the legal, unregulated, barely studied substances that have been quietly slipping into the American drug supply and killing people in numbers that should be front-page news every single morning. Not the Hollywood kind of drug crisis. Not the after-school special kind. The real kind. The kind where a guy buys something online that's technically not illegal because nobody's gotten around to banning it yet, takes it in his bedroom on a Tuesday, and nobody finds out what it was until a toxicologist with a microscope and a very dark sense of humour pieces it together 3 weeks later. So before you get comfortable, I want to take a second to genuinely, sincerely thank the person who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, this one matters. The fact that you're out here sending in topics like this, topics that most people are too uncomfortable to say out loud, is exactly what makes this channel worth making. Your input shapes every single one of these videos, and I don't take that lightly. So thank you. If you're new here and you actually enjoy what I do, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. No pressure, no guilt, just, if this is your kind of thing, and leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. There's always some ungodly hour somewhere, and I find that strangely comforting. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify. Link is in the description if you want to take the show on the road, or more accurately, to bed. Now, dim the lights. Put on a fan if you've got one. That soft, steady hiss in the background does something wonderful to the nervous system. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Maybe put your phone face down on the nightstand because you're not going to need it. Tonight we're going somewhere dark and we're going slowly. Because here's what I want you to think about for just a moment before we begin. Have you ever noticed that something can be completely legal and absolutely catastrophic at the same time? Have you ever wondered how a substance with no clinical trials, no safety data, no long-term studies, and a name that sounds like a rejected Star Wars character, like 5-MeOM-IPT or Alpha PvP, can just show up in someone's bloodstream, sold openly online, shipped to their front door, technically within the law? Have you ever thought about what it means that entire generations of people are testing new molecules on their own bodies the way scientists test them on rats, except without the lab coats, the controlled environment, or anyone monitoring their vitals? How does a chemical go from a university research paper to a gas station shelf to a death certificate in under 3 years and nobody stops it? Who is making these things? Who is selling them? And why, when people start dying, does the government always seem to be about 6 months too late? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the modern American drug market. The year is right now. The substance in the pill you just took has a Wikipedia page that was created 48 hours ago. The emergency room doctor has never heard of it, and the package it came in says not for human consumption. Welcome. Let's talk about how we got here. Let's start at the very beginning, because this whole story falls apart if we don't nail this down first. The term research chemical sounds almost respectable, doesn't it? Like something being carefully studied in a clean white laboratory by serious people in sensible shoes. The reality is considerably messier. A research chemical, sometimes called a designer drug, a novel psychoactive substance, or, in the classier corners of the internet, an NPS, is simply a substance that has been synthesized, usually by altering the molecular structure of a known drug in a way that keeps it just outside the reach of existing law. It hasn't been approved for medical use. It hasn't been safety tested on humans. It hasn't been around long enough to know what it does to your liver in year 3 or your brain in year 5. What it has done is exist in a legal grey zone long enough for someone to sell it to you legally, right now, today, with a straight face. Think of it like this. Imagine someone takes a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, a perfectly normal, well-understood recipe, and swaps out one ingredient for something that looks almost identical but has never been eaten before. They don't know if it'll taste fine, cause a rash, or remove your ability to feel your left arm, but because the ingredient isn't on any list of prohibited substances, they can sell the cookie, legally, and on the package they write not for consumption, and people eat the cookie. That is research chemicals in a nutshell. The process works because drug law, in the United States and most of the world, is built around specific named compounds. Heroin is illegal, cocaine is illegal, MDMA is illegal. Those specific molecules are scheduled, controlled, prohibited. But if you take MDMA and nudge the molecular structure slightly, move a methyl group here, substitute an atom there, you may produce a new compound that functions similarly in the human brain, but is not technically MDMA, and therefore not technically illegal. The new compound may have never been tested on a living thing. There may be no data whatsoever on how much of it will kill you, what it does to your heart, whether it interacts with other medications, or what happens if you take it twice. None of that matters for purposes of legality. It's novel, it's unscheduled, it's a research chemical. The terminology itself is revealing. The word research implies scientific rigor, institutional oversight, careful methodology, and fairness. There is a legitimate world of research chemistry, academic pharmacologists synthesizing novel compounds to study receptor binding, understand disease mechanisms, and potentially develop new medicines. That world is real, it is valuable, and it operates under strict regulatory frameworks. But the term research chemical, as it is used in the context we're discussing tonight, has essentially nothing to do with that world. It is a borrowed vocabulary, a respectable-sounding label, applied to substances whose primary function is psychoactive effect, and whose primary virtue, commercially speaking, is that nobody has gotten around to banning them yet. The global inventory of novel psychoactive substances has grown with staggering speed. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified over 1,000 distinct novel psychoactive substances between 2009 and 2023. New compounds are reported at a rate of roughly 100 per year. Some last a few months on the market before being scheduled and disappearing. Others persist for years. A small number work their way into the permanent drug supply in ways that become very difficult to dislodge. The speed of this proliferation is not an accident. It is a feature of a system where the incentives for creating new compounds are strong, the barriers are low, and the consequences for the people doing the creating are often minimal. For the people doing the consuming, the consequences can be considerably more serious and considerably more permanent. The United States government, to its credit, saw this coming, partially. Back in 1986, as part of the Federal Analog Act, lawmakers tried to create a legal safety net. Any substance that was substantially similar to a Schedule I or Schedule II controlled substance and intended for human consumption would be treated as a controlled substance itself. On paper, elegant. In practice, a disaster of nearly comedic proportions. The word substantially turned out to be doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting in that sentence, because chemists are very good at making molecules that are functionally identical in effect, but technically different enough on paper to slip right through the net. Change one carbon chain here, swap out one atom there, and suddenly you're not selling an illegal drug, you're selling a research chemical for scientific study, obviously. The Analog Act had two major problems, and they worked against each other beautifully. The first was the word substantially. Courts interpreted it inconsistently. What counted as substantially similar to a controlled substance? Similar in chemical structure. Similar in pharmacological effect. Similar in how it made you feel. Different judges, different jurisdictions, different trials produced different answers. Prosecutors building cases under the Analog Act faced the prospect of hiring expert witnesses to debate molecular geometry in front of juries who were not chemists, and then hoping the jury could follow the argument well enough to convict. Some did, many didn't. The legal uncertainty made prosecutions difficult, expensive, and unpredictable. The second problem was the phrase intended for human consumption. Defense attorneys were remarkably successful at arguing that their clients, the people selling powder in labelled bags through commercial websites, had not intended the product for human consumption. The bag said so right on it. Not for human consumption. The website said it was sold for research purposes. How could you prove intent? The legal fiction held up in court more often than it had any right to. Meanwhile, the chemistry kept evolving. The Analog Act was designed to address the problem as it existed in 1986, when a relatively small number of novel compounds were being produced by a relatively small number of people. It was not designed for a world in which a single chemistry paper could spawn dozens of new structural variants in a matter of months, manufactured at scale overseas, sold through global e-commerce platforms to millions of customers, and replaced the moment any individual variant was scheduled. The tool that Congress built was a fishing net. The problem it was trying to catch had learned to be water. The result has been a kind of regulatory whiplash, the government scheduling compounds as fast as it can, manufacturers reformulating faster, and the law perpetually chasing a market it cannot quite reach. By the mid-2010s, the DEA was issuing emergency scheduling orders for new synthetic cannabinoid compounds at a pace that would have seemed absurd a decade earlier. Dozens of substances were scheduled. Dozens more appeared. The Analog Act, the legal cornerstone of the government's response to this problem for nearly 40 years, has been described by drug policy scholars as insufficient, outpaced, and in need of fundamental reform. That reform has not arrived. The substances have continued to arrive with considerable more punctuality. If there is a single human being most directly responsible for the world we're about to spend the next hour exploring, it is a soft-spoken, deeply thoughtful American pharmacologist named Sasha Shulgin, known to his admirers and detractors alike as Sasha. A former Dow Chemical researcher who held a DEA schedule, one researcher's license, Shulgin spent decades in a backyard laboratory in the hills of California, synthesizing, documenting, and personally testing hundreds of new psychoactive compounds. His two self-published books, Pickle and Tickle, which stand for phenethylamines I have known and loved and tryptamines I have known and loved, are simultaneously two of the most important pharmacological documents of the 20th century and the most thoroughly detailed instruction manuals for making mind-altering drugs ever printed. He didn't intend them as a recipe book. But that is precisely what they became. Shulgin's intellectual project was not in his own framing about getting high. He was genuinely interested in consciousness, in what altered states of perception could reveal about the human mind, the nature of experience, and the biochemistry of self. He was a serious scientist with serious credentials, and the compounds he synthesized were documented with a precision and care that was, in its way, admirable. He personally tested every compound he created, carefully noting the dosage, the onset, the quality of the effect, the duration, and the aftermath. His lab notebooks read like the diary of a man who approached his own nervous system as the most interesting experiment available to him. The problem, of course, is that Shulgin published his synthesis routes, all of them, in books that anyone could buy, in a format that any competent chemist could follow. Pickle described the synthesis of over 200 phenethylamine compounds, including MDMA, MDA, and dozens of structural analogues whose effects he had personally characterized. TIHKAL covered tryptamines with similar thoroughness. When these books were published, in 1991 and 1997 respectively, They were read with great interest by a certain kind of person, the kind of person who was looking for exactly this kind of information. The DEA, which had granted Shulgin his research license, was not pleased. The agency reportedly staged a formal inspection of his laboratory shortly after Pikal's publication, cited violations and revoked his license. But the books were already out. The information was already circulating. You cannot unpublish a chemistry textbook, and you cannot unread a synthesis route. In the years that followed, the compounds Shulgin described began appearing in drug markets around the world, and the framework he established of exploring structural space around known psychoactive compounds to find novel variants became the operational model for an entire industry. Shulgin himself seemed genuinely conflicted about this legacy. He believed in the right of individuals to explore their own consciousness, and he believed the compounds he had studied had genuine therapeutic potential that mainstream science was ignoring. He was not wrong about the latter. Several compounds he characterized have since entered clinical trials for conditions including PTSD and depression. But the world his work helped create was considerably messier than the careful, documented, harm-conscious exploration he had envisioned. He died in 2014, at 88, still writing and still thinking. The market his books had helped build was by that point global, industrial, and killing people at a rate he almost certainly never imagined. The first major wave of research chemicals to crash over the American public didn't arrive in a darkened lab or on an obscure internet forum. It arrived at the gas station. Sometime around 2008, a product began appearing on convenience store shelves under brand names like Spice, K2, Black Mamba, and Scooby Snacks. It was sold in colourful foil pouches, labelled as herbal incense, and stamped with a reassuring disclaimer not for human consumption. A disclaimer that everybody who bought it treated as aggressively as people treat the do not eat packet in a new pair of shoes. The active ingredients were synthetic cannabinoids, man-made chemicals sprayed onto dried plant material to mimic the effects of THC. They did not in fact mimic the effects of THC. They were frequently far more potent, unpredictable, and dangerous, and for several years they were completely legal. Let's talk about why synthetic cannabinoids are not simply fake weed, because this matters enormously and is widely misunderstood. Natural cannabis contains THC, which binds to the CB1 receptor in the brain with what pharmacologists call partial agonist activity. It activates the receptor, but incompletely, and the brain has some ability to modulate the response. Synthetic cannabinoids, particularly the early JWH series, compounds originally developed by Clemson University researcher John W. Huffman. And yes, the JWH stands for his initials, and yes, he was mortified when he found out what was happening, were full agonists. They hit the receptor harder and with far less predictability. The result was not the familiar, manageable cannabis experience. It was something more extreme: intense anxiety, racing heart, psychosis, seizures, and in a significant number of cases, death. Users who had smoked cannabis for years found themselves completely unprepared for what synthetic cannabinoids actually did. The packaging said herbal, the name said weed. The experience said something had gone very wrong. Emergency rooms in states across the country began reporting clusters of patients with symptoms that looked nothing like standard cannabis intoxication. People in acute psychosis, people with heart rates so elevated that the monitor alarmed, people who could not form coherent sentences. This was new, this was terrifying, and this was, at the time, legal. The DEA began issuing emergency scheduling orders for specific synthetic cannabinoid compounds starting in 2010. But here is where the cat-and-mouse dynamic that would define the next decade and a half was established in its clearest form. As each compound was scheduled, manufacturers simply introduced a new one. The JWH compounds went. A B-pinaka came. That was scheduled. A B-fubinaka appeared. The market moved faster than the law, and every new compound that replaced a scheduled one arrived with no data on its potency, its toxicity, or the dose that separated a strong high from a fatal one. By some estimates, over 150 distinct synthetic cannabinoid compounds have appeared in the US drug market since 2008. Dozens of people have died. The colourful foil packages are considerably harder to find on gas station shelves now. But the compounds have not gone away. They have migrated online, migrated into other products, and migrated into a population of users who learned, incorrectly, to think of synthetic cannabinoids as a mild, legal alternative to a plant. If synthetic cannabinoids were the quiet first act, bath salts were the shrieking, chaotic second one. Around 2010 and 2011, a category of synthetic stimulants, primarily substituted cathinones, chemical cousins of the active compound in the cat plant, began appearing in head shops and online marketplaces under names like Ivory Wave, Purple Wave, and Vanilla Sky. They were sold as bath salts, for your bath. The effects, according to emergency room reports, poison control calls, and deeply alarmed journalists across the country, included extreme agitation, paranoia, hallucinations, violent behaviour, dangerously elevated heart rate, and in some cases psychosis that lasted for days. They were not relaxing, they were not for your bath, and for a brief, bewildering window of time, they were completely legal. The most prominent cathinone compounds in this first wave were mephedrone, known on the street as MCAT or Meow Meow, a name that sounds significantly less alarming than it should, MDPV, and methylone. These compounds produce stimulant and empathogenic effects broadly similar to MDMA or cocaine, but with a pharmacological profile that was less well understood and a duration that was, in the case of MDPV particularly, considerably longer. MDPV, methylenedioxypyrovalerone, was described by users as producing an almost irresistible compulsion to redose, combined with a paranoia so intense it was clinically indistinguishable from acute psychosis. People who had taken it were arriving in emergency rooms convinced they were being followed, that there were things in the walls, that they were dying. Some of them were not wrong about the last part. The media coverage that bath salts received in 2011 and 2012 was intense, often sensationalized, and occasionally wildly inaccurate. The most notorious example is the case commonly referred to as the Miami cannibal attack, in which a man named Rudy Eugene attacked a homeless man in a gruesome and horrifying way, and which was immediately and confidently attributed by media commentators to bath salts. The subsequent toxicology report found only cannabis. Eugene had not taken bath salts. The story had already gone around the world 3 times by the time the correction was issued, and the correction travelled considerably less far. The bath salts narrative was established, and it proved resistant to facts. What the media coverage got right, however, was the severity of what these substances could do to a person. The cases of genuine bath salt psychosis were real, numerous, and deeply frightening. Poison control centres received thousands of calls. Emergency departments in states with high prevalence reported being overwhelmed by cases involving violent, disoriented, superhuman-seeming patients who could not be reasoned with. The compounds were scheduled by the DEA in 2012 under the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, and then, in the way that was becoming familiar, they were replaced by new compounds, new cathinones, new stimulants with new names, moving faster than the scheduling process could follow. For most of human history, if you wanted to obtain an illegal substance, you had to know a person. You had to make a phone call, stand on a corner, or whisper across a bar. The transaction was human, which meant it was traceable, risky, and limited by geography. And then came the internet. First the forums, Erowid, Blue Light, Reddit threads that got progressively less subtle, and then, in 2011, Silk Road. The first major dark web marketplace, Silk Road operated like an eBay for controlled substances, running on the Tor network and accepting only Bitcoin. At its peak, it listed thousands of drug products from hundreds of vendors, with customer reviews and star ratings and everything your suburban Amazon experience had trained you to expect. Research chemicals, in particular, flourished in this environment because they often weren't even illegal, meaning vendors could sometimes ship them through ordinary mail with minimal legal exposure. The architecture of Silk Road was, in a grim and technical sense, genuinely innovative. The Tor network anonymized internet traffic by routing it through a series of encrypted relays, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to trace activity back to specific users or vendors. Bitcoin provided a payment mechanism that did not require names, bank accounts, or any of the traditional financial infrastructure that law enforcement could subpoena. An escrow system held funds until buyers confirmed receipt, reducing the risk of exit scams and creating something that functioned almost like consumer protection for the purchase of illegal substances. The market had vendor ratings, it had feedback systems, it had dispute resolution processes. It was, in the language of its users, professional. The thing about professionalism in this context is that it made purchasing more accessible, not less dangerous. Before Silk Road, buying drugs involved friction. You had to know people, establish trust, take on social risk. Silk Road removed most of that friction. A person with a laptop, a Tor browser, and a Bitcoin wallet could order substances from vendors they had never met, shipped to addresses they could manage with some creativity, with no interpersonal interaction required at all. The barrier to entry dropped. The potential customer base expanded. And the substances on offer included not just established, illegal drugs, but a constantly refreshing catalogue of research chemicals, novel compounds, things that had never been in a drug supply before, things that had no dosage guides, no safety data, and no history. Silk Road was seized by the FBI in October of 2013. Its founder, Ross Ulbricht, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The prosecution was presented in part as a decisive blow against online drug markets. It was not a decisive blow. Within days, replacement markets appeared. The dark web drug market proved to be, in the terminology of network security, highly resilient, decentralized enough that taking down any individual node simply redirected traffic to other nodes. Over the decade following Silk Road's closure, the overall volume of dark web drug transactions increased. Research chemicals remained a significant and growing portion of that inventory. The marketplace had not been defeated, it had been briefly inconvenienced, and then it had evolved. If you pull back the camera far enough and trace the supply chain of most research chemicals sold in the United States, whether online through dark web markets, or in the disguised form of legal highs, you end up in the same place with remarkable consistency: China. Specifically, a network of unregulated chemical manufacturing facilities, largely concentrated in provinces like Hebei, Jiangsu, and Shandong, that have been producing novel psychoactive substances at industrial scale since at least the mid-2000s. These are not back-alley operations with bubbling flasks and meth cook aesthetics. Many are sophisticated chemical companies, registered legally, staffed by trained chemists, producing materials that are, in many cases, entirely legal under Chinese law, because they haven't been scheduled there either. They ship worldwide, often in labelled parcels, and they are extraordinarily good at staying one molecule ahead of international drug control lists. The economics of this supply chain are important for understanding why it has been so difficult to disrupt. A kilogram of a novel synthetic opioid manufactured in China and shipped to the United States might cost a few $100s to produce. Diluted, pressed into pills and sold retail, that kilogram might generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. The markup is extraordinary. The risk for the manufacturers is relatively low. Chinese law has historically been reluctant to prosecute the production of substances not scheduled under Chinese law, and the physical distance between manufacturer and end user creates significant legal insulation. The people most exposed to legal risk in this supply chain are the mid-level importers and distributors in the United States, not the chemists in Hebei who synthesize the compound. The relationship between the United States government and China over this issue has been a persistent source of diplomatic friction. American officials have repeatedly pressed their Chinese counterparts to expand scheduling and enforcement of novel psychoactive substance manufacturing. China has, at various points, responded with meaningful action. In 2019, following significant diplomatic pressure, China announced the scheduling of an entire class of fentanyl analogues, a move that the DEA described as significant and that did appear to reduce the direct-from-China fentanyl flow temporarily. But the response was partial, the enforcement was uneven, and manufacturers adapted by shifting to compounds outside the new scheduling or by routing product through third countries. The postal and shipping systems that carry this product have been another persistent vulnerability. The United States Postal Service was, for years, the preferred carrier for many dark web vendors, partly because it lacked the scanning and screening infrastructure that private carriers employed, and partly because opening first-class mail without a warrant was legally complicated. Legislation passed in 2018 required international packages to include electronic advance data, essentially shipping manifests, before entering the United States, which improved the ability of Customs and Border Protection to flag suspicious shipments. But the volume of international mail entering the United States is measured in the hundreds of millions of packages annually. The screening capacity, even significantly improved, cannot check everything. The packages keep arriving. Some of them contain things that will kill people, and most of those things will never be intercepted. Here is the fundamental structural problem at the heart of everything we're discussing tonight. Stated as plainly as it can be, the legal process for classifying a new drug as a controlled substance in the United States takes time, often 18 months to 2 years for an emergency scheduling, and potentially years longer for permanent scheduling, and chemists can synthesize a new structural variant in far less time than that. This is not a conspiracy. This is not incompetence exactly. It is a mismatch between the speed of chemistry and the speed of bureaucracy, and it is a mismatch that people are dying inside of every single day. By the time the DEA issues an emergency temporary scheduling order for a new synthetic opioid, the Chinese lab that was producing it has already pivoted to a slightly different compound that the new order doesn't cover. The game never stops. The law just keeps arriving late to the party. The formal scheduling process, when it runs at its standard pace, is a lengthy one. A substance must be identified as a public health concern, which requires it to have caused enough harm to have entered the toxicology and clinical literature. Then the DEA must conduct a formal review, which includes an assessment by the Department of Health and Human Services, a public comment period, and a federal register publication. The entire process, running normally, can take years. The emergency scheduling provision speeds this up considerably, allowing the DEA to place a substance in Schedule 1 on a temporary basis for up to 2 years, while the formal process continues. But even emergency scheduling is measured in months, not days. The monitoring systems that identify new compounds in the drug supply have improved significantly since the early 2010s, but they still operate on a lag. The National Forensic Laboratory Information System collects data from forensic labs around the country. The Drug Enforcement Administration's Special Testing and Research Laboratory analyzes seized samples. Academic researchers studying novel psychoactive substances publish findings. But there is an interval, sometimes months, sometimes longer, between a new compound entering the market and that compound being identified, characterized, and reported to the systems that would trigger a scheduling response. People use the compound during that interval. Some of them die during that interval. Their deaths may be attributed to causes other than the actual compound during that interval. The scheduling lag is not a problem that has gone unnoticed by policymakers. Various proposals have been advanced over the years to address it. Analog scheduling acts that cover entire chemical families rather than specific compounds, blanket bans on new psychoactive substances modelled on the United Kingdom's approach, expedited scheduling procedures, enhanced early warning systems. Some of these proposals have been implemented in partial form. None of them has solved the underlying problem, which is that the incentive to create new compounds is strong, the chemistry is accessible, and the law will always, by its nature, be responding to what has already happened rather than anticipating what is coming next. Fentanyl itself, the synthetic opioid that is now the leading cause of overdose death in the United States, responsible for more deaths annually than car accidents, guns, or any other single cause, is not technically speaking a research chemical in the traditional sense. It was developed in 1960 by Dr. Paul Janssen, and it has legitimate medical applications. But the fentanyl analogues that began flooding the drug supply starting around 2013 and 2014, compounds like acetylfentanyl, carfentanil, butyrfentanyl, and a cascading parade of structural variants, these absolutely fit the research chemical framework. They were synthesized in China, shipped to the United States, and introduced into the drug supply with almost no warning. Carfentanil, one of the most potent of the group, is estimated to be 10,000 times more potent than morphine. It is used, in legitimate contexts, to sedate elephants. In 2016, it started showing up in heroin sold in Ohio. To understand why, fentanyl analogues are so extraordinarily lethal in the context of the illicit drug supply, you need to understand what happens when a compound is 10,000 times more potent than morphine. The difference between a dose that produces a high and a dose that stops a person's breathing, what pharmacologists call the therapeutic index, or in this context the margin of safety, becomes vanishingly small. We are talking about quantities measured in micrograms. A microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. A few micrograms too many, and the respiratory centres of the brain stop receiving the signal to breathe. It is not a dramatic process. There is no convulsion, no violent episode. The person simply goes to sleep, and then they stop breathing. And if nobody is there with naloxone and a reason to use it, they do not wake up. The introduction of carfentanil into street heroin created a situation that is, in retrospect, entirely predictable. People with tolerance calibrated to heroin or even to standard fentanyl were suddenly encountering something orders of magnitude more potent in an indistinguishable form. The product looked the same, it smelled the same, it was sold as the same thing. There was no way to know, without laboratory analysis, that the pharmacological stakes had changed completely. The resulting wave of overdoses in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest in 2016 was staggering. Ohio, which had already been one of the most heavily affected states in the opioid crisis, saw its overdose death numbers spike in ways that overwhelmed the tracking systems trying to count them. Acetylfentanyl, the first fentanyl analogue to appear widely in the US supply, was somewhat less potent than pharmaceutical fentanyl, but it was longer acting and produced respiratory depression that could be slower to reverse with naloxone. Butyrfentanyl followed. Then carfentanil. Each one brought a new wave of deaths, each one arrived with no preparation, and each one was followed by a scheduling order that came too late for the people who had already died and too early to catch the next compound, which was already being synthesized. Fentanyl analogues were terrifying enough on their own, but as international pressure mounted and China began scheduling some of the more notorious compounds, something new emerged, as it always does. A category of synthetic opioids that bore almost no structural resemblance to fentanyl or any previously known opioid began appearing in the drug supply. Compounds like nitazenes, a class of synthetic opioids originally developed in the 1950s and then abandoned because they were considered too dangerous, were essentially rediscovered from old pharmaceutical literature, synthesized fresh, and released into a drug market populated by people with no tolerance for them and no knowledge of their existence. Isotonitazine, metonitazine, butonitazine, names that mean nothing to the average person and that most emergency physicians had never encountered. Potency estimates for some nitazene compounds rival or exceed that of fentanyl, and in the years after 2019, they began appearing in overdose toxicology reports across the country. The story of the nitazenes is a particularly striking illustration of how the research chemical market operates. These compounds were not invented by modern chemists looking for novel highs. They were discovered in the 1950s by a Swiss pharmaceutical company, Ciba, which was investigating potential pain medications. The nitazenes showed extraordinary analgesic potency. Some compounds in the class were estimated to be more powerful than anything known at the time. They were also found to carry a high risk of dependence and respiratory depression. Ciba decided they were too dangerous to develop, and the research was shelved. The compounds sat in the literature, technically described synthesis routes published in scientific papers, potency data available to anyone who looked, for more than 60 years, and then someone looked. The first isotonitazene detections in the United States occurred around 2019 and 2020. The compound appeared primarily as an adulterant, mixed into other drugs, present in products that users believed contained something else. It was initially misidentified or missed entirely by standard toxicology screens because it was so new that most labs weren't testing for it. By the time it was identified and began appearing in forensic reports, it had already been responsible for a significant number of deaths. Metonitazine followed. Butonitazine followed. Each new nitazene variant arrived from the same general supply chain, Chinese manufacturers, and each one required its own scheduling action, its own detection development, its own learning curve for the emergency medicine physicians encountering it for the first time. What makes the nitazene emergence particularly significant is what it reveals about the depth of the resource the illicit market is drawing from. The pharmaceutical literature contains decades of abandoned research, compounds that were studied, found to be too dangerous or too limited for medical use, and never developed further. That literature is a catalogue of potential novel psychoactive substances, most of them with at least partial characterization of their effects and synthesis routes accessible to trained chemists. The research chemical market has barely begun to work through this catalogue. The nitazenes were not an isolated discovery. They were a signal. Every year, America's poison control centers receive hundreds of thousands of calls. Buried within that data, if you know how to read it and are willing to sit with the discomfort of what it tells you, is a remarkably clear picture of the research chemical crisis unfolding in real time. In 2010, calls related to synthetic cannabinoids were essentially zero. By 2015, they numbered in the tens of thousands annually. Calls related to novel synthetic opioids followed a similar trajectory. The National Poison Data System tracks this information. Researchers publish analyses. Academic papers accumulate. and the gap between what the data shows and what the general public understands to be happening is wide enough to park a truck inside. Part of that gap is deliberate. These crises are not politically convenient. Part of it is structural. Toxicology is slow. Identification of new compounds takes time and money, and many deaths attributed to unknown substance involve research chemicals that simply weren't identified. The poison control data is valuable in part because it captures cases that don't result in death. The hospitalizations, the emergency calls, the cases where something went badly wrong, but naloxone or emergency care intervened in time, these cases are in a sense the most informative ones because they provide data on what the drugs are doing, what symptoms they're producing, and who is being exposed to them. Information that you cannot collect from a fatality with the same richness or detail. The challenge is that poison control calls are voluntary. A person experiencing a severe reaction to a research chemical has to call or have someone call on their behalf. Many don't. The data captures a fraction of the actual exposure. The geographic distribution of the data tells a story as well. Synthetic cannabinoid exposures have been disproportionately concentrated in urban areas, particularly in populations experiencing homelessness or housing instability. Synthetic opioid exposures have followed the existing geography of the opioid crisis, with higher rates in Appalachia, the Midwest, and the Northeast. Novel stimulant exposures have appeared in clusters that sometimes track to specific local markets or supply chains. None of this is random. The research chemical market is not uniformly distributed across the population. It concentrates in communities where vulnerability is already high, where access to harm reduction resources is already low, and where the consequences of encounters with the healthcare system are already complicated by poverty, legal status, and stigma. What the data also shows for anyone willing to look is that the research chemical crisis is not a youth phenomenon in any simple sense. Certainly young adults are disproportionately represented in synthetic cannabinoid exposures, but novel opioid exposures increasingly reflect the demographics of the broader opioid crisis. Middle-aged adults, often in rural or suburban communities, often with histories of prescription opioid use, who have shifted to street drugs after prescriptions became unavailable, and whose exposure to fentanyl analogues and novel synthetic opioids was not chosen. They did not know they were taking a research chemical. They thought they were taking heroin or a pain pill. The research chemical was what the dealer happened to have. When a person overdoses on a traditional opioid, heroin, oxycodone, even standard fentanyl, the drug naloxone, commonly known by the brand name Narcan, can reverse the overdose and restore breathing. It works by binding to opioid receptors and displacing the drug. For many synthetic opioids, particularly the nitazenes and some fentanyl analogues, this remains true, but the doses required can be dramatically higher, and the window for effective intervention can be shorter. For synthetic cannabinoids, stimulants, and other classes of research chemicals, naloxone does nothing at all because those substances don't act on opioid receptors. First responders arriving at a research chemical overdose are frequently operating blind. They don't know what substance is involved, they don't know if naloxone will help, and the patient may not be able to tell them because the patient is unconscious. Hospitals are seeing substances they have never encountered in patients they cannot adequately treat. The naloxone problem has several dimensions, and they compound each other in uncomfortable ways. The first is the efficacy question. Standard naloxone dosing, developed in an era when heroin was the primary opioid of concern, was calibrated to a drug whose potency was orders of magnitude lower than carfentanil or some of the nitazene compounds. The intranasal naloxone products that are most widely available in the community, the ones distributed through harm reduction programs, the ones sold over the counter at pharmacies since 2023, deliver doses that may be insufficient to reverse an overdose from a highly potent synthetic opioid. Emergency medical personnel have reported administering multiple doses of high-concentration intravenous naloxone to patients who remained unresponsive, eventually responding only after quantities that would have been extraordinary even 5 years ago. The second dimension is the coverage gap. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist. It does not affect synthetic cannabinoids, cathinones, novel stimulants, or any number of other research chemical classes. A person who has taken a synthetic cannabinoid and is experiencing the severe cardiovascular and neurological effects that these compounds can produce, elevated heart rate, seizures, hypothermia, will receive no benefit from naloxone. The first responder who arrives and administers it anyway, because it is the tool available, is not doing anything harmful, but they are not doing anything helpful either. The patient needs supportive care and time. What they often get is a medication that doesn't apply to their situation, administered by a provider who has never seen this compound before and has no protocol for managing it. The third dimension is training. Emergency medical technicians, paramedics, and emergency department nurses and physicians are trained on the drugs that exist when their training materials are written. The research chemical market produces new compounds faster than medical training curricula update. Clinicians encounter substances with no clinical literature, no dosing guidance, no case series, and no treatment protocols. They manage symptoms, they control the seizure, they support the breathing, they cool the hypothermia, and they hope. Most of the time this works. When it doesn't, there is no clear answer about what else could have been done. There is perhaps no more cynical 3-word phrase in the modern American commercial landscape than not for human consumption. It is stamped on packages of synthetic cannabinoids. It appears on bath salt packaging. It decorates the labels of compounds sold as plant food, research chemicals, cleaning products, and pond water treatment. The legal function of this disclaimer is to help manufacturers argue that they never intended the product to be ingested by a person, which, under the Federal Analog Act, is one of the required elements for prosecution. The practical function of this disclaimer is to make absolutely no difference whatsoever to the person who bought it in order to get high. Everyone knows what it means. The manufacturers know what it means. The retailers know what it means. The customers know what it means. The disclaimer is a shared fiction, a legal fig leaf so thin it barely casts a shadow, and for years it was sufficient to keep entire industries operating in the open. The legal architecture around this disclaimer has been tested extensively in court, with results that are, charitably, inconsistent. In some cases, prosecutors have successfully argued that the not-for-human consumption label was pretextual, that everything about the product, from its marketing to its packaging to the context in which it was sold, demonstrated that human consumption was obviously the intended use. In those cases, the Analog Act has been applied and convictions have resulted. In other cases, defense attorneys have successfully argued that the label's presence was sufficient to defeat the intent element, that a vendor cannot be convicted of intending something for human consumption when they explicitly stated the opposite on the packaging. The absurdity of this legal situation is most visible when you look at the products themselves. Synthetic cannabinoids sold as herbal incense came in packaging featuring cartoon characters, tropical imagery, and flavour descriptions. They were sold in convenience stores next to the candy. The idea that a reasonable person might believe these products were genuinely intended for use as incense is the kind of idea that requires extraordinary commitment to maintain. But the law, as written, created enough ambiguity to sustain the fiction, and the fiction sustained an industry. The not-for-human consumption label has also created a secondary problem. It has allowed manufacturers and vendors to sidestep the regulatory requirements that apply to substances intended for human use. Products intended for human consumption must meet safety standards, disclosure requirements, and quality controls. products not intended for human consumption must meet considerably less. A research chemical vendor is not required to test for purity, disclose ingredients, provide dosing information, or warn about drug interactions. A consumer purchasing a synthetic cannabinoid labeled incense has no legal right to any of the protections that would normally apply if the same substance were sold honestly. The fiction does not just protect the vendor, it removes protection from the buyer. The popular mental image of a research chemical user, young, reckless, thrill-seeking, perhaps attending a rave while wearing impractical clothing, is not wrong exactly, but it is dramatically incomplete. Research chemicals are used across an enormous range of demographics and for an enormous range of reasons. Some users are genuinely curious pharmacologists or psychonauts, people who carefully document their experiences, cross-reference dosing information, and approach novel substances with a seriousness that would surprise most people. Others are recreational users who believe, not entirely unreasonably, that buying a legal substance from a commercial website is safer than buying an illegal one from an unknown dealer. Others still are people with substance use disorders who have shifted to synthetic options because they are cheaper, more accessible, and harder to detect on standard drug tests. And increasingly, people are using research chemicals without knowing it because the drugs they think they bought are adulterated or entirely replaced with novel compounds. The psychonaut community, this self-identifying community of people who deliberately explore altered states of consciousness through novel substances, often with what they consider rigorous methodology, represents one of the more visible and documented populations of research chemical users. Forums like Erowid and Blue Light, and later Reddit communities, have served as platforms for trip reports, dosing discussions, and harm reduction information. The psychonauts have collectively generated a substantial body of anecdotal data on the effects of many research chemicals, data that, while not scientifically rigorous, has in some cases provided the only available information on what a new compound does to a human being before the medical literature catches up. They have also documented an uncomfortable number of deaths and serious injuries among their own community, a reminder that careful methodology and genuine curiosity do not eliminate the fundamental problem of testing an unknown compound on a human nervous system. The involuntary research chemical user is, in many ways, the most important demographic to understand in the context of the current crisis. These are people who are not choosing research chemicals. They're choosing what they believe to be heroin, or Xanax, or Adderall, or cannabis, and receiving something else, or something mixed with something else, because the supply chain has been adulterated, because their dealer's supplier adulterated it, because a pill press somewhere produced something that looks exactly like a pharmaceutical, but contains an entirely different compound. These users have no opportunity to apply even the limited harm reduction measures available to someone who knows what they are taking. They cannot look up a dosing guide. They cannot test for a compound they do not know is present. They cannot make an informed decision about risk. They are simply exposed. The demographic data on who is dying from research chemicals in the broadest sense, including synthetic opioids in the drug supply, is sobering. The opioid overdose death toll in the United States has increasingly reflected not the stereotyped image of the young urban drug user, but the demographics of a country in economic distress. Middle-aged, disproportionately white, disproportionately rural or suburban, often with histories of chronic pain and prescription drug use that preceded their encounter with the illicit market. These are people who did not plan to become research chemical casualties. Most of them, in the most fundamental sense, did not know they were. One of the most consistently lethal features of the research chemical crisis is the invisibility of the substances themselves. A few milligrams of carfentanil, a quantity so small it would be invisible to the naked eye, light enough to be carried on a breath of air, is potentially fatal. You cannot see it in a pill. You cannot taste it in a powder. You cannot smell it in a tablet that has been pressed to look exactly like a 10 milligram oxycodone. Fentanyl test strips, which were for years classified as drug paraphernalia in many states and therefore illegal, can detect the presence of fentanyl in a substance, but they cannot tell you the concentration, and they cannot identify compounds that are chemically dissimilar to fentanyl. Mass spectrometry and laboratory analysis can identify novel compounds accurately, but this equipment is not available to the average person deciding whether to take a pill at a party at 11 on a Friday night. The fentanyl test strip story is, in miniature, a reasonably complete illustration of how American drug policy has struggled to keep harm reduction tools available in proportion to the harms they are meant to reduce. Fentanyl test strips are inexpensive paper strips, similar to pregnancy tests, that change colour in the presence of fentanyl. They are not perfect. They cannot detect all fentanyl analogues with equal sensitivity. They cannot quantify concentration. They cannot identify non-opioid contaminants. But studies have consistently found that people who have access to fentanyl test strips and use them are more likely to change their behaviour based on a positive result, using less, using with someone present, having naloxone available, or not using at all. The strips reduce deaths. This has been demonstrated in multiple research contexts. For years, however, fentanyl test strips were classified as drug paraphernalia under state laws modelled on the Federal Drug Paraphernalia Act, laws designed to prohibit the sale of equipment used to consume illegal drugs. The classification was technically defensible. The strips are primarily used in the context of illegal drug use, but classifying them as paraphernalia made them illegal to distribute in many states, which meant harm reduction organizations that wanted to distribute them faced legal risk, and their potential users could not legally obtain them. The states began decriminalizing fentanyl test strips relatively recently, in many cases within the past several years, and as of the mid-2020s, a majority of states have done so. But the period during which the strips were illegal or restricted corresponds almost exactly to the period of the most severe fentanyl and synthetic opioid mortality. The broader testing problem, beyond fentanyl strips, reflects the fundamental information asymmetry of the research chemical market. The people selling novel substances know what they are selling roughly. The people buying them frequently do not. Laboratory-based drug checking services, which allow people to submit samples for mass spectrometry analysis and receive detailed chemical composition reports, exist in some European countries as a standard harm reduction tool. In the United States, they are available in limited form through a small number of harm reduction organizations operating in legal grey zones. The gap between what is technically possible in terms of drug testing and what is actually available to the people most at risk is measured in lives. In 2022, drug enforcement agencies across the United States began seizing something that had not been seen before in meaningful quantities. Brightly coloured fentanyl pills and powder, quickly dubbed rainbow fentanyl by law enforcement and the media, seized in colours including blue, pink, green, yellow and purple. These pills were pressed to look like candy, specifically like the colourful sugar candies marketed to children. Law enforcement agencies, including the DEA, warned that this appeared to be a deliberate effort to attract new, younger users, or at minimum to make fentanyl less visually threatening to people unfamiliar with drugs. The public response was intense. Parents panicked. Schools sent home warnings. Halloween was briefly treated as a potential mass poisoning event. The reality, as researchers subsequently pointed out, was more complicated. Most drug experts noted that existing users, not children, remain the primary target market, but the underlying issue was real. The supply was evolving, and it was evolving in ways designed to reach new populations. The interpretation of rainbow fentanyl divided experts fairly cleanly along lines that reflected their different analytical frameworks. Law enforcement agencies, whose operational experience centers on supply interdiction and whose communications tend toward alert and alarm, presented the colored pills as a clear and deliberate strategy to hook younger, naive users who might be attracted by the candy-like appearance. Drug policy researchers and public health experts were more skeptical, pointing out that the available evidence did not strongly support the targeting children theory. Illicit drug markets are primarily organized around existing users with existing demand. Attracting completely naive, non-using children to an opioid product would require those children to have both access to the pills and a reason to take them. The product was more plausibly designed to attract curiosity-motivated, recreational users, or to move through markets where pills visually resembling prescription drugs had become expected. What was less disputed was the underlying message carried by the rainbow fentanyl seizures, which was the same message carried by every other development in the synthetic opioid supply chain since 2013. The product is designed to be taken by a human being. It is designed to look like something it is not, and the person taking it has no reliable way to know what they are actually consuming. Whether the target was a child attracted by a candy-coloured pill or an adult attracted by a pill that looked like a pharmaceutical, the mechanism was the same. The product was a deception. The deception was in the service of a market, and the market had no regulatory requirement to disclose what it was actually selling. The Halloween panic, while largely unfounded in terms of actual poisonings of children through tampered candy, reflected something real about the cultural moment, a widespread anxious recognition that the drug supply had become dangerous in ways that felt genuinely novel and genuinely uncontrollable. The fear that any bright-coloured object might be a disguised lethal substance is, from one angle, paranoid and disproportionate. From another angle, in a world where pills pressed to look exactly like pharmaceuticals routinely contain compounds that their buyers did not choose, it is a fairly reasonable response to an information environment that offers no reliable guarantees about what anything actually is. When the FBI shut down Silk Road in October of 2013 and arrested its founder, Ross Ulbricht, there was a moment of optimism in certain federal law enforcement circles. The dominant dark web marketplace was gone. The model had been disrupted. Perhaps this was the beginning of the end. It was not the beginning of the end. Within weeks, replacement markets had appeared. Silk Road 2 launched almost immediately. Alpha Bay rose to become larger than Silk Road had ever been before being seized in 2017. Hansa followed. Dream Market followed. Each takedown was followed by a proliferation of successors, often more sophisticated, more security-conscious, and more geographically distributed than their predecessors. The largest dark web marketplace ever identified, the Russian-language platform Hydra, operated from 2015 until its seizure in 2022 and processed an estimated $5 billion in transactions over its lifetime. Research chemicals, fentanyl analogues, and novel psychoactive substances flowed through all of these markets throughout their existence. The evolution of dark web markets after Silk Road's closure illustrates a dynamic that security researchers call the hydra effect. Remove one head, others grow back in its place, often better adapted to survive the conditions that destroyed their predecessor. Each successive generation of dark web markets incorporated lessons from the failures of the previous generation. They diversified infrastructure, distributed administration across multiple operators in multiple jurisdictions, developed better operational security protocols, and reduced the single points of failure that had allowed law enforcement to take down centralized platforms. the largest markets began operating with anonymous administration, market operators who were unknown even to their vendors, and developed elaborate security protocols that made identifying and arresting operators considerably more difficult. The Alpha Bay seizure in 2017 was conducted simultaneously with the seizure of Hansa, in an operation that revealed a particularly sophisticated law enforcement tactic. After taking covert control of Hansa, Dutch police operated the market for several weeks before shutting it down, collecting data on users who had migrated to Hansa from Alpha Bay in the mistaken belief that it was a safer alternative. The operation produced significant intelligence and a number of arrests. It also produced a round of market evolution, as dark web market users drew the lesson that any market could be compromised and began using decentralized alternatives with no single administrative control point. Hydra, the Russian-language platform that became the dominant global dark web marketplace, operated with a structure that was explicitly designed to resist Western law enforcement. Its servers were located in Russia. Its administrators were located in Russia. Its primary user base was in Russian-speaking countries, though it had significant reach into Central Asian and European markets. It operated largely outside the jurisdictions of the agencies most aggressively pursuing dark web markets. Its seizure in 2022 by German authorities working with American counterparts was a significant enforcement achievement, but the research chemical and synthetic opioid supply chains that had run through Hydra did not stop when Hydra did. They found other routes. Faced with a federal response that moved, to put it charitably, methodically, some states decided to act on their own. Florida, for instance, passed aggressive analog legislation that attempted to schedule entire chemical families rather than individual compounds, meaning that any structural variant of a banned substance would itself be banned, without requiring a separate scheduling action for each new compound. Other states pursued similar approaches. The theory was sound. The practice revealed new complications almost immediately. Analog scheduling laws, when written broadly enough to catch novel compounds, sometimes swept up legitimate pharmaceutical precursors, industrial chemicals, and substances with medical applications. Enforcement required toxicologists and chemists who could identify novel compounds, expertise that most state law enforcement agencies did not have and could not quickly develop. And manufacturers who were watching these developments closely simply reformulated again. The patchwork of state-level responses to research chemicals created, among other things, a geography of legality that proved useful to the market. A compound banned in Florida might remain legal in Georgia. A substance scheduled in Ohio might be available in neighboring Indiana. The patchwork created both regulatory arbitrage, businesses locating in states with more permissive regulations, and trafficking patterns, with legal substances purchased in permissive states and transported to states where they were prohibited. This is not a novel phenomenon in American drug policy. It is essentially the same dynamic that drives cannabis trafficking across state lines and cigarette smuggling from low-tax to high-tax states. But in the context of novel psychoactive substances, where a legal substance in one state might be chemically quite similar to a controlled substance in another, the legal landscape became genuinely confusing for everyone involved. Several states attempted to address the research chemical problem through consumer protection and product safety frameworks, rather than exclusively through criminal scheduling. The argument was straightforward. These products were being sold to people who intended to consume them. They made implicit claims about their effects, and they were manifestly unsafe. If you couldn't prosecute the seller as a drug dealer because the substance wasn't scheduled, perhaps you could prosecute them as a seller of an unsafe consumer product, or pursue them through civil liability. Some of these approaches produced results in specific cases. They did not produce systemic change, largely because the manufacturers and major distributors were in China, outside the reach of state consumer protection law. The state-level response also illustrated the significant resource disparities in the enforcement ecosystem. The DEEA has specialized forensic and analytical capabilities, an international network of cooperation, and substantial funding. State and local law enforcement agencies dealing with novel psychoactive substance cases were frequently encountering compounds they could not identify with available equipment, building prosecutions around substances whose scheduling status was uncertain, and managing case volumes that their existing infrastructure was not designed to handle. Training, equipment, and legal guidance that might have equipped state and local agencies to respond more effectively were inconsistently available, inconsistently funded, and inevitably trailing behind the pace of market evolution. The people who sell research chemicals in the United States exist along a broad spectrum. At one end are the sophisticated online vendors, often based domestically, operating nominally legitimate businesses, carefully labeling products as not for human consumption and watching scheduling developments with professional attention. In the middle are smaller operations, sometimes individuals, who source bulk product from overseas, repackage it, and sell it through a combination of dark web markets and surface web storefronts. At the far end are street-level dealers who may have no idea that the fentanyl analogue in the product they are selling is a research chemical, a novel synthetic compound, or anything other than the stuff my supplier gave me. Prosecutions have targeted all three categories, with varying degrees of success. The most prominent cases have involved lengthy federal sentences, but the supply chain has proven extraordinarily resilient to prosecution, largely because it is distributed, international, and constantly reformulating. The sophisticated domestic vendor occupies a peculiar position in the legal landscape. These operations, of which a number were identified and prosecuted in the 2010s, often went to considerable lengths to maintain a veneer of legitimacy. They had websites with professional design. They described their products using scientific nomenclature. They included disclaimers about research purposes. They processed payments through legitimate channels. Some of them maintained customer service operations and issued refunds for damaged products. They behaved in almost every observable way like normal e-commerce businesses, except that the products they sold were powerful psychoactive compounds with no safety data and no regulatory oversight. The prosecutions that succeeded against these operations generally relied on one of two approaches: establishing that the vendor knew the products were intended for human consumption, despite the disclaimers, or pursuing cases under specific state analog laws where the legal standard was more achievable. The resulting sentences, in several high-profile cases, were severe. Federal drug charges carry mandatory minimums that can result in decades of imprisonment. This produced a deterrent effect on some domestic vendors, contributing to a shift of the market toward dark web platforms and toward direct from China supply chains that were more difficult to prosecute. The street-level dealer's position is the most complicated and, in some ways, the most tragic. A significant portion of the dealers distributing fentanyl adulterated product in American cities are not aware of the specific compounds in their supply. They bought it from someone who bought it from someone, and the adulteration happened somewhere in the supply chain before it reached them. They are, in a technical legal sense, distributing a controlled substance, and they are exposed to the full weight of federal drug trafficking law, including charges of distribution resulting in death, which can carry sentences of 20 years to life. The person who synthesized the compound in a Chinese laboratory, or the person who imported it into the United States in bulk, faces in many cases less legal exposure than the street-level dealer who had no knowledge of what they were selling. This inversion of legal risk relative to actual culpability in the supply chain is one of the features of the current enforcement landscape that drug policy scholars have identified as both ethically problematic and practically counterproductive. In a standard overdose death investigation, the medical examiner orders a toxicology screen. That screen tests for a panel of known substances, opioids, stimulants, benzodiazepines, the usual suspects. If the substance that killed the person is on that panel, it will be detected. If it is not on the panel, it will not be detected, and the cause of death may be recorded as undetermined or attributed to a substance that was present but wasn't actually responsible for the death. Novel research chemicals are frequently not on standard toxicology panels for the simple reason that standard panels are designed around known substances and research chemicals are, by definition, novel. This means that deaths caused by research chemicals are likely being systematically undercounted, not through negligence, but because the tools used to detect these substances are always trailing behind the substances themselves. How far behind? That is, of course, one of the things we do not know. Medical examiners and forensic toxicology laboratories operate under significant resource constraints that are often invisible in public discussions of the overdose crisis. A comprehensive toxicology analysis using mass spectrometry, the gold standard for identifying unknown compounds, is expensive, time-consuming, and requires specialized equipment and trained personnel. Not all medical examiner offices have this capability in-house. Not all jurisdictions can afford to contract it routinely. In many parts of the country, the standard toxicology panel run on an overdose death costs a fraction of what a comprehensive analysis would cost, produces results faster, and answers the clinical question adequately most of the time, because most of the time, the person died from something on the standard panel. The problem arises in the cases where they didn't. The forensic identification of novel compounds is itself a complicated technical challenge. Mass spectrometry produces spectra, patterns of molecular fragmentation, that are compared against libraries of known compounds. If the compound being analysed is not in the library, the instrument will not identify it. Building a library entry requires having a reference sample of the compound, synthesizing it or obtaining it through legitimate channels, and running it through the instrument under standardized conditions. For truly novel compounds, things that have never appeared in a forensic laboratory before, this process takes time and resources that the laboratory may not have immediately available. By the time a new compound has been fully characterized and added to forensic databases, it may have been circulating in the drug supply for months or years. The consequence is a death count that is almost certainly an undercount, by a margin that cannot be precisely determined. The CDC's drug overdose death statistics, which are the primary public health benchmark for the scale of the crisis, capture deaths where a specific compound was identified in toxicology. Deaths where the compound was not identified are either not counted as drug overdose deaths, or are counted under general categories that provide no information about the causative substance. The true number of deaths attributable to novel research chemicals and synthetic opioids is unknown, and it is unknown in a direction. We know it is higher than the reported figures. We do not know by how much. No discussion of the research chemical and novel psychoactive substance landscape is complete without addressing kratom, a substance that occupies its own strange and bitterly contested position somewhere between herbal supplement, traditional medicine, harm reduction tool, and dangerous drug of abuse. Derived from the leaves of the Mitragina speciosa tree native to Southeast Asia, kratom has been used in traditional medicine for centuries in countries like Thailand and Malaysia. In the United States, it arrived as a commercial product in the early 2000s, sold in smoke shops, head shops, and increasingly mainstream supplement retailers. Its primary active compounds, metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine, interact with opioid receptors in the brain, producing effects that range from mild stimulation at low doses to sedation and pain relief at higher ones. The DEA attempted to schedule kratom as a Schedule I substance in 2016, then reversed course after an intense lobbying effort from kratom advocates and users. The debate about its safety, its potential for dependence, and its role in the opioid crisis has not been resolved. The kratom debate is unusual in the context of this discussion because it involves a plant product with a long history of human use, a vocal community of advocates who report significant benefits, and scientific evidence that is genuinely mixed rather than simply absent. On one side are medical researchers and regulators who point to kratom's opioid receptor activity, the documented cases of kratom-associated deaths, the potential for dependence and withdrawal, and the absence of FDA approval or rigorous safety trials. On the other side are advocates, many of them people in recovery from prescription opioid or heroin addiction, who report that kratom has been instrumental in managing their withdrawal, reducing their cravings, and maintaining their functioning, and who argue that scheduling kratom would remove a tool that is keeping people alive. Both positions contain genuine truth, which is part of what makes this particular debate so difficult. Kratom does have opioid receptor activity. It does carry dependence potential. People have died in circumstances where kratom was detected in toxicology, though attribution of cause of death in polydrug cases is frequently complicated. And at the same time, the community of kratom users genuinely includes a significant population of people who have used it to manage opioid use disorder with a degree of success that conventional treatment has not always provided. This is not a category of user whose testimony should be dismissed. The FDA's position on kratom has been consistently negative. The agency has issued warnings, pursued import alerts, and maintained that kratom's opioid-like properties make it an unapproved drug that should be regulated as such. The DEA's failed scheduling attempt in 2016, which was reversed under significant public and congressional pressure, illustrated the degree to which kratom had developed a political constituency that other novel psychoactive substances have not. The kratom advocacy community is organized, vocal, and has been effective at communicating a harm reduction narrative that resonates with a public that has also become deeply suspicious of the regulatory frameworks that oversaw the prescription opioid crisis. Whether kratom ultimately comes closer to the medicine or the menace end of the spectrum is a question that science has not yet definitively answered. If the nitazene story illustrated how obscure pharmaceutical history can be weaponized by the illicit drug market, the Xylazine story illustrates something even more alarming: how a substance that was never intended for human use at all can become one of the defining features of a drug crisis in a matter of years. Xylazine, sold under the brand name Rompen, is a veterinary sedative and analgesic used in large animals, particularly horses and cattle. It is not approved for human use. It does not act on opioid receptors, meaning naloxone has no effect on it. Beginning in Puerto Rico in the early 2000s and spreading to the northeastern United States by the mid-2010s, Xylazine began appearing as an adulterant in the heroin and fentanyl supply. By 2022, the CDC reported that Xylazine was detected in fentanyl samples in 48 of 50 states. Its presence in the drug supply dramatically complicates overdose response, because users receiving both fentanyl and Xylazine can be revived from the opioid component with naloxone while remaining sedated by the Xylazine, and Xylazine causes distinctive, deep, necrotic skin wounds that can require amputation. The question of why Xylazine entered the drug supply is, like so many questions in this area, only partially answerable. The most straightforward explanation is economic. Xylazine is cheap, widely available through agricultural and veterinary supply chains, and extends the duration of effect when combined with fentanyl, making the product more appealing to buyers and more profitable for sellers. Whether its introduction was deliberate or accidental the result of a conscious decision to adulterate or the result of supply chain contamination is not known. What is known is that once it appeared in a market, it spread because it changed the product in ways that buyers sometimes reported preferring, at least in the short term. The opioid high was extended and deepened by the Xylazine sedation. The fact that this combination was considerably more dangerous than fentanyl alone was a downstream consequence that did not change the immediate market dynamics. The necrotic wound problem associated with Xylazine deserves particular emphasis because it represents a harm that is distinct from overdose and that is both more visible and, in some ways, more difficult to address. Xylazine causes vasoconstriction. It narrows blood vessels, and when injected in the context of intravenous drug use, it can cause severe tissue death at injection sites and at sites distant from injection. The wounds that result are deep, progressing to the bone in severe cases, resistant to standard wound care, and prone to infection. Treatment requires wound care expertise, often surgical debridement, and in the most severe cases, amputation of affected limbs. Providing this level of care to people who are actively using drugs in conditions of poverty and housing instability is extraordinarily challenging. The wounds have become, for clinicians working in communities heavily affected by the fentanyl-xylazine supply, one of the most visceral manifestations of the research chemical crisis. There is a category of interventions that public health researchers have found with considerable consistency across multiple decades and multiple countries to meaningfully reduce deaths, hospitalizations, and disease transmission associated with drug use. These interventions go by the collective name of harm reduction, and they include things like needle exchange programs, naloxone distribution, fentanyl test strip availability, drug checking services, supervised consumption sites, and drug education that prioritizes accurate information over abstinence messaging. The evidence base for most of these interventions is reasonably robust. The political opposition to them in the United States has also been reasonably robust, rooted in concerns that reducing the immediate harms of drug use implicitly condones drug use itself, and that making drug use safer makes it more prevalent. This debate has been ongoing for several decades and shows few signs of resolution, while in the background the research chemical supply continues to evolve and the death toll continues to accumulate. Needle exchange programs, now more commonly called syringe services programs, have been studied extensively and found to reduce HIV and hepatitis C transmission among people who inject drugs without increasing drug use in the communities where they operate. They also serve as points of contact between people who use drugs and health services, providing naloxone, wound care, referrals to treatment, and basic medical screening to a population that otherwise has limited healthcare access. The evidence for their effectiveness is, by the standards of public health research, quite strong. Their political history in the United States is a story of funding restrictions, state-level bans, and a long, slow, incomplete normalization. Federal funding for syringe services was prohibited for most of the period between 1988 and 2016. The restriction was lifted partially under the Affordable Care Act, then reinstated, then lifted again. The stops and starts in funding have directly affected program availability in the communities where need was greatest. Supervised consumption sites, facilities where people can use pre-obtained drugs under medical supervision with immediate access to naloxone and emergency care, have operated in Canada, Australia, and numerous European countries for decades. They have never been associated with an increase in drug use in their surrounding communities. They have been associated in the research with reductions in overdose deaths, reductions in public drug use, and increases in referrals to treatment services. The first legally operating supervised consumption sites in the United States opened in New York City in late 2021 following years of legal and political battles. They have since reversed numerous overdoses. The broader adoption of this model in the United States remains politically contentious in most jurisdictions. The common thread in the harm reduction debate is a disagreement about what the goal of drug policy should be. If the goal is to reduce drug use, harm reduction interventions are at best neutral and at worst counterproductive because they do not require abstinence as a condition of service. If the goal is to reduce death, disease, and suffering among people who are currently using drugs, harm reduction interventions are among the most effective tools available. This is not a technical disagreement. It is a values disagreement, and values disagreements do not resolve through better data. What they sometimes respond to is the sheer weight of mortality, the accumulated evidence that the current approach is not keeping people alive, and that weight over 2 decades of escalating overdose deaths has slowly shifted the political centre of gravity in ways that were not imaginable in 2005. The DEA has the authority to place a substance on Schedule 1 on an emergency basis without going through the full legislative scheduling process, a power that exists precisely for situations like this one. Emergency scheduling can be implemented relatively quickly, typically within a matter of weeks once the process begins, and it provides 2 years of temporary scheduling, while permanent scheduling is pursued. This is not nothing. Emergency scheduling has been used to respond to numerous research chemical crises, including the scheduling of several synthetic cannabinoid families, multiple cathinone compounds, and numerous fentanyl analogues. But the tool has limitations that are significant in the context of the research chemical problem. Emergency scheduling acts on specific chemical structures. It bans the compound named and compounds that are sufficiently similar. A skilled chemist can often synthesize something functionally similar but structurally distinct in the time it takes to process the paperwork. The DEA's use of emergency scheduling accelerated dramatically through the 2010s as the synthetic cannabinoid and synthetic opioid crises intensified. The agency issued more emergency scheduling orders in the decade between 2010 and 2020 than in all prior decades combined. This pace of activity represented a genuine institutional response to a genuine emergency. It also revealed the limitations of the tool. Each emergency scheduling order was a specific response to a specific compound or small group of compounds. Each order required the same procedural steps. Each order was followed by market adaptation. The DEA was running as fast as it could on a treadmill that was also accelerating. Congress has periodically attempted to provide the DEA with broader tools. The Fend-Off Fentanyl Act, passed in 2024, designated fentanyl trafficking as a national security threat and provided additional authorities. Earlier legislation had expanded the scope of analog scheduling, but the fundamental constraint that specific compounds must be specifically identified to be specifically banned has remained in place, because broader approaches carry civil liberties implications that have made Congress reluctant to enact them. A blanket ban on any substance with psychoactive properties, for instance, would technically cover alcohol, caffeine, and most psychiatric medications. The specificity that makes scheduling legally defensible is also what makes it inadequate to the pace of the market. The international scheduling dimension adds another layer of complexity. The DEA acts within domestic law, but the research chemical market is global. A compound that the DEA has emergency scheduled can continue to be legally manufactured in China, legally exported to third countries, and imported into the United States through routes that customs enforcement cannot fully monitor. Domestic scheduling changes the legal status of the compound inside the United States without affecting its availability from overseas sources. International scheduling through the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs is a slower process still, requiring consensus among member states and operating on timelines measured in years, the gap between the speed of the market and the speed of international drug control institutions is, if anything, wider than the gap between the market and domestic regulatory responses. The human cost of the research chemical crisis is recorded most clearly not in policy papers or toxicology reports, but in the stories of the people left behind. Parents, siblings, partners, and friends who lost someone to a substance they had never heard of. A substance that may not have had a common name yet, that may not have been on any banned list, that may have been sold to their person as something else entirely. These are deaths that arrive without warning, often in people with no prior history of serious drug use, people who took something once at a party or ordered something online that seemed safe because it was technically legal. The research chemical crisis has produced a particular category of grief complicated by confusion, by the sense that the rules should have protected someone and didn't, by the frustration of trying to explain to a funeral home director what a novel synthetic opioid is. These families have increasingly become advocates, testifying before Congress, lobbying for scheduling changes, and demanding that the crisis be treated with the urgency it deserves. The specific texture of research chemical grief has a quality that distinguishes it from other kinds of sudden loss. There is in many cases a long period of not knowing. The toxicology takes time. The compound may not be on the standard panel. The medical examiner may return an inconclusive result and then a revised result weeks later, as more sophisticated analysis is completed. During this period, the family is in a particular limbo. They know their person is dead, they do not fully know why, and the uncertainty carries its own specific weight. When the answer finally arrives, when a name is attached to the compound, or when even the final report admits that the substance remains unidentified, the answer often raises more questions than it resolves. Parents who have lost children to research chemicals describe a consistent experience of institutional disorientation. The substance that killed their child may not have been illegal. The seller may have operated legally. The product may have been labelled with warnings that technically satisfied legal requirements. The systems that they believed existed to protect people, the drug control laws, the regulatory agencies, the criminal justice system, turn out to have had gaps precisely where their child fell through. The grief is compounded by a righteous anger that has nowhere obvious to go because the responsible parties are diffuse, often overseas, and sometimes operating entirely within the law. This community of bereaved families has been one of the more politically effective constituencies in the drug policy space in recent years. They bring a moral clarity to the issue that is difficult to dismiss, and a specificity of personal experience that cuts through the abstraction of policy debate. Organisations like Song for Charlie, founded by a father whose son died from a counterfeit pill, have developed significant reach in communities where traditional drug prevention messaging has not. The families who didn't know have made it their purpose to ensure that other families will know about fentanyl test strips, about the danger of counterfeit pills, about the research chemical supply chain that took someone they loved. Their advocacy is, in a profound sense, part of the story of this crisis. The United States is not the only country grappling with the research chemical crisis, but it is not handling it identically to its peers either. The United Kingdom implemented a sweeping Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016 that took a fundamentally different approach. Rather than scheduling specific substances and trying to keep pace with new compounds, the Act banned the production, supply and importation of any substance capable of producing a psychoactive effect in humans, with specific exemptions for alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and licensed medicines. Critics argued the law was unenforceable and would drive the market underground. Supporters argued it removed the legal grey zone entirely. Australia, New Zealand, and several other countries have pursued similar blanket approaches. the European Union has developed an early warning system for novel psychoactive substances through the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, designed to identify new compounds in the drug supply and alert member states faster than individual national responses could. None of these approaches has solved the problem. All of them offer data points that the American policy debate has been slow to incorporate. The United Kingdom's Psychoactive Substances Act has had mixed results that reflect the difficulty of the underlying problem. On the positive side, it effectively ended the open retail trade in legal highs, the head shops and online storefronts that had operated openly under the previous regime. The colourful packaged products that had been available on British high streets disappeared from legitimate retail channels. On the negative side, the market moved underground rather than disappearing. Research chemicals continued to circulate. They simply circulated through less visible channels. The Act also created some unintended consequences. Its broad definition of psychoactive substances raised questions about the regulation of products like e-cigarettes and poppers, requiring legislative clarification. And the enforcement challenges are significant, proving that a specific substance is psychoactive in a specific person is legally and technically complicated in ways that courts have been asked to work through case by case. Portugal's approach, which has attracted international attention since its implementation in 2001, is often described as decriminalisation but is more precisely characterised as a public health reframing. Portugal decriminalised the personal possession of all drugs, not just cannabis, all of them, while maintaining criminal penalties for trafficking. People found with personal use quantities of drugs are referred to dissuasion commissions composed of lawyers, social workers and health professionals who assess the person's situation and can refer them to treatment, impose administrative sanctions, or simply send them on their way. The approach was accompanied by significant investment in treatment and harm reduction services. Portuguese drug overdose death rates, which had been among the highest in Europe in the 1990s, fell to among the lowest following the reforms. Whether this model is transferable to the United States, a vastly larger, more heterogeneous and more politically contested context, is a question that generates fierce disagreement among people who have studied both countries closely. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, the EMCDDA, represents a different kind of international response, a shared early warning infrastructure rather than a shared legal framework. Member states of the European Union feed data into a centralised system that monitors novel psychoactive substances appearing in their drug supplies, identifies new compounds through forensic analysis, and issues formal alerts when a new substance represents a public health concern. The system is not perfect. It still operates on a lag, and it does not prevent new compounds from entering the market. But it allows European drug regulators and public health authorities to respond to emerging threats faster than any individual country could acting alone, because the surveillance net is wider. A novel compound appearing in Dutch forensic samples in January might generate an alert that reaches Portuguese and Swedish health authorities in February rather than waiting for each country to independently identify the compound through its own surveillance systems. Australia's approach to novel psychoactive substances has evolved over the 2010s toward a model that combines scheduling actions with a robust harm reduction infrastructure that is, relative to the United States, significantly more developed. Australian states and territories have operated needle syringe programs since the late 1980s, with federal funding that has been more consistent than in the United States. Naloxone has been available without prescription in Australia since 2016, years before comparable measures were implemented broadly in the US drug checking services, where people can submit substances for laboratory analysis, operate at Australian music festivals and some fixed sites, providing real-time intelligence about what is circulating in the drug supply, while also offering individual users information that can change their behaviour. These services have identified novel compounds, adulterated products, and dangerous dosing inconsistencies in ways that have directly informed both individual harm reduction and public health responses. New Zealand took a particularly interesting and ultimately unsuccessful approach in 2013, when it passed the Psychoactive Substances Act, legislation that attempted to create a regulatory pathway for novel psychoactive substances to be legally sold if they could demonstrate through clinical testing that they carried a low risk of harm. The theory was compelling. Rather than playing whack-a-mole with new compounds, create a legal regulated market for low-risk products that would crowd out the unregulated high-risk alternatives. In practice, the legislation collapsed almost immediately. The public outcry over the retail availability of regulated psychoactive products, many of which were sold in corner stores, produced political pressure that the government could not sustain, and the Act was amended within a year to prohibit all novel psychoactive substances pending approval. No product has ever received approval under the framework. The New Zealand experiment is cited both by those who argue that regulated frameworks for novel substances are unworkable in practice, and by those who argue that the New Zealand implementation was too hasty and too visible to survive its political environment. What the international comparisons most clearly demonstrate is that there is no country that has solved this problem, and no single approach that has emerged as clearly superior. The research chemical crisis is global, the supply chain is global, and it is responding to global market incentives that no individual country's policy can fully address. What individual countries can do, and what the most effective international responses have done, is reduce the harm experienced by their own populations through a combination of monitoring, harm reduction, treatment access, and enforcement calibrated to realistic goals. The United States has the capacity to do all of these things more effectively than it currently does. The distance between capacity and action is a political distance, not a technical one. And in that gap, people keep dying. In 2023, a researcher studying the online promotion of novel psychoactive substances found active marketing content for dozens of research chemicals on platforms including Instagram, TikTok, Telegram, and YouTube. Some of this content was from vendors. Some was from enthusiast communities documenting their experiences. Some was from accounts that appeared to be affiliated with commercial operations without being transparent about it. The intersection of social media culture and the research chemical market is a subject that law enforcement and platform safety teams are still developing tools to address. The challenge is compounded by the fact that many of the substances being discussed are, at the time of discussion, technically legal, which complicates the application of policies designed to prohibit drug promotion. By the time a substance has been scheduled and unambiguously fits within platform drug policies, it may already have been replaced by a new compound that doesn't. The social media ecosystem around research chemicals and novel psychoactive substances is, in its own way, a sophisticated information system, one that serves both to distribute potentially harmful information and to generate genuinely useful harm reduction data, often simultaneously and by the same participants. Forums and communities where people discuss research chemicals share dosing reports, adverse event warnings, and identification of dangerous compounds with a speed that the formal scientific literature cannot match. When a new compound produces severe adverse effects in early users, the community often knows about it before the medical literature does. This information, if it reaches the right people in time, can prevent deaths. The challenge is that it reaches people who are already in the market, and the same channels distribute it alongside content that normalizes use, minimizes risk, and sometimes directly promotes commercial vendors. The ratio of safety information to promotional content varies wildly depending on the community, and the average new user stumbling in has no reliable way to calibrate which is which. Telegram, the encrypted messaging platform, has become a particularly significant infrastructure for the research, chemical and drug market more broadly. Its combination of strong encryption, large group and channel functionality, and historically permissive approach to content moderation made it a preferred platform for both harm reduction communities and commercial drug vendors. Drug market channels on Telegram operate with varying degrees of openness, some posting pricing and product availability in ways that are, by any reasonable standard, open drug dealing on a platform with hundreds of millions of users. Platform responses to this content have been inconsistent. The encrypted nature of the platform makes monitoring and enforcement technically difficult, and the same channels that facilitate commercial transactions also carry genuine community harm reduction information, making blanket approaches to content moderation particularly complicated. Telegram began taking more aggressive action against drug market channels around 2023 and 2024, removing some of the most visible operations. The market adapted, as it always does, migrating to newer channels, smaller groups, and alternative platforms. The influencer dimension of this problem is one that has received less public attention than it deserves. There are accounts, primarily on platforms where video content and community building intersect, that have built substantial followings around content that documents drug experiences, including research chemical experiences. These accounts vary enormously in their framing, from explicit promotion and normalization to genuine harm reduction-oriented documentation that includes adverse effects and recovery experiences. The age distribution of their audiences is a significant concern. Research on social media influence and adolescent behavior consistently finds that perceived peer norms, what young people believe their peers are doing, are a significant predictor of behavior. Content that normalizes research chemical use, even without explicitly promoting it, shapes those perceived norms in ways that downstream harm metrics may not immediately capture. A 17-year-old watching someone describe a research chemical experience in casual matter-of-fact language is receiving a signal about what is normal, what is manageable, and what is worth trying, even if the content never includes an explicit recommendation. The platforms themselves occupy an uncomfortable position in this ecosystem. Their content moderation policies, when applied to drug-related content, face the fundamental challenge that the research chemical market poses to every institution that tries to regulate it. The substances change faster than the rules do. A policy that prohibits content promoting Schedule 1 controlled substances does not necessarily cover a compound that was synthesized last month, has not yet been scheduled, and is currently being discussed in thousands of posts across multiple platforms under a chemical name that no automated moderation system has been trained to recognize. Training systems to recognize the discussion of novel compounds requires knowing about those compounds first, and in the lag between a compound's emergence and its identification by platform safety teams, it can be freely discussed, marketed, and promoted. The information environment that young people are navigating is one in which genuinely dangerous substances are often indistinguishable at the content level from legitimate discussions of pharmacology, harm reduction, or casual experimentation. The platform liability question, whether social media companies bear any legal responsibility for harms that result from drug-related content distributed on their platforms, has been raised but not resolved. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides broad immunity to platforms for content generated by their users, has historically shielded platforms from civil liability for drug promotion content in the same way it shields them from liability for most user-generated content. Legislative efforts to create carve-outs from this immunity for specific categories of harmful content have faced both First Amendment concerns and significant lobbying opposition from the technology industry. The current legal framework does not create strong incentives for platforms to invest in the kind of proactive monitoring and removal that the scale of the problem would arguably require. The content keeps circulating, the compounds keep arriving, and somewhere in the algorithmic recommendation engine of a platform optimized for engagement, a teenager gets their first introduction to something that has a Wikipedia page that is 3 weeks old. One of the most significant developments in the research chemical and synthetic opioid crisis over the past several years has been the proliferation of counterfeit pharmaceutical pills manufactured with pill presses, inexpensive machines, widely available for purchase, that can produce tablets that are visually indistinguishable from genuine prescription medications. Counterfeit pills pressed to look like oxycodone, Xanax, Adderall, and other controlled substances, and containing fentanyl analogues, or other novel psychoactive substances, have been seized in enormous quantities across the United States. The DEA has reported that in recent years, more than half of the counterfeit pills it has tested contain potentially lethal doses of fentanyl. This means that the research chemical and synthetic opioid crisis has merged, in a very practical sense, with the prescription drug misuse problem. A person who believes they are taking a pill of known provenance and known content may be taking a novel synthetic opioid that they have never knowingly chosen to use. The pill press itself is not a complex or expensive piece of equipment. Tablet compression machines used in pharmaceutical manufacturing are sophisticated, precisely calibrated instruments costing tens of thousands of dollars. But simpler pill presses, capable of producing tablets that look convincingly like pharmaceutical products, are available commercially for a few hundred to a few $1,000s, marketed for legitimate purposes including tablet supplement manufacturing. They have been widely adopted by illicit manufacturers who combine fentanyl or fentanyl analogues with binding agents and colorants to produce pills that match the appearance of pharmaceutical products, photographed and reverse-engineered from the legitimate supply. The M30 oxycodone pill, a small, round blue tablet, became so widely counterfeited that it acquired its own street terminology and its own associated mortality statistics. The distribution of counterfeit pills has followed and expanded upon existing drug market infrastructure. In areas where there was already an established market for diverted prescription opioids, where people had been buying pills from dealers for years, counterfeit pills entered as apparent substitutes that looked the same, were marketed as the same product, and were sometimes cheaper. The buyers, many of whom had been purchasing genuine diverted pills for years and had calibrated their use accordingly, had no reliable way to know that the product had changed. The result was a category of overdose deaths, people dying from doses they had taken many times before, in forms that looked identical to what they had always taken, that was particularly difficult for public health messaging to address. The response to the counterfeit pill crisis has included both supply-side and demand-side elements. The DEA has prioritized seizures of pill presses and pill press equipment, and has pursued trafficking cases involving counterfeit pills under enhanced penalties. The harm reduction response has emphasized fentanyl test strip distribution and, more recently, messaging campaigns specifically targeting the risk of counterfeit pills. The One Pill Can Kill campaign, launched by the DEA in 2021, represented an attempt to reach recreational prescription drug users, particularly young people, with a message that any pill obtained outside a pharmacy was potentially counterfeit and potentially lethal. The campaign has been evaluated for effectiveness with mixed results. Its core message is factually accurate but operates against a backdrop of entrenched market behavior and supply-side dynamics that public education alone cannot shift. University health and counseling centers across the United States began reporting, starting in the late 2010s and accelerating sharply through the early 2020s, a pattern that alarmed campus administrators and public health researchers alike. Hospitalizations, psychiatric crises, and overdoses among students involving substances that standard toxicology panels could not identify. Some of these involved classic research chemicals, synthetic cannabinoids, cathinones. Others involved novel opioids. Many appeared to involve substances that had been sold as or mixed with more familiar drugs. College students represent a population with several specific risk factors in the context of the research chemical crisis. Relative inexperience with drug effects and warning signs, social environments that normalize experimentation, economic access to online markets, and a cultural tendency to perceive legal or semi-legal substances as inherently safer than illegal ones. Campus prevention programs, long designed around alcohol and cannabis, have been slow to adapt to a threat landscape that changes faster than curriculum review cycles. The campus drug environment has changed substantially over the past decade and a half in ways that campus health infrastructure has generally not kept pace with. Traditional campus drug prevention programs were developed in an era when the primary concerns were alcohol misuse, cannabis use, and to a lesser extent stimulant misuse in the context of academic pressure. The pharmacological landscape those programs were designed to address was relatively stable. The drugs were known quantities, their effects were well characterized, and the dosing and harm profiles were understood. Research chemicals and novel psychoactive substances introduced a fundamentally different kind of problem, one where the substance category was not fixed, where potency was unpredictable, and where the product available on Tuesday might be chemically distinct from the product available on Saturday. A prevention curriculum written in 2018 was already incomplete by 2020. A curriculum written in 2020 was already incomplete by 2022. The counterfeit pill problem has intersected with campus drug culture in ways that are particularly concerning. College students who use Adderall non-medically, a well-documented phenomenon driven by academic pressure and the social normalization of stimulant use for productivity, now face the possibility that pills obtained outside a pharmacy contain fentanyl or other novel compounds. The DEA and campus health organizations have documented cases of students who obtained what they believed to be Adderall and took a counterfeit pill containing fentanyl. These are not students with opioid use disorders or histories of high-risk drug use. They are in many cases academically motivated young people who made a decision they had made before, in a supply landscape that had silently and fatally changed around them. The student population most at risk from counterfeit stimulant pills is one that may have little or no prior opioid exposure, meaning their tolerance is zero, and a dose of fentanyl that a person with opioid use disorder might survive is likely fatal to them. The social architecture of campus drug use creates specific harm amplification dynamics that are worth understanding. College parties, Greek life events, and music venue contexts share several features. Substances are often obtained and consumed rapidly, in social settings where admitting distress carries social cost, where bystanders may be intoxicated themselves, and where calling emergency services may feel threatening because of potential disciplinary consequences. Many universities have adopted medical amnesty policies that protect students who call for help during a drug overdose from disciplinary action, specifically to address the documented phenomenon of students dying while bystanders hesitated because they were afraid of getting in trouble. These policies have saved lives. They have not uniformly changed campus culture, because culture is stickier than policy, and the fear of social and legal consequences runs deeper than a policy statement can reach in a single academic year. The mental health dimension of the campus research chemical problem is underappreciated. Synthetic cannabinoids, in particular, have been associated with acute psychotic episodes that can be indistinguishable from the onset of serious psychiatric illness. A student who smokes synthetic cannabinoid product at a party and presents to a campus counseling center or emergency department in acute psychosis 3 hours later may receive a psychiatric evaluation that does not identify the substance because the substance is not on the toxicology panel. They may be admitted for psychiatric observation, started on antipsychotic medication, and observed for several days before the psychosis resolves as the compound clears their system. Or the episode may be sufficiently severe or prolonged that the clinical picture becomes genuinely complicated. Campus mental health services have reported cases where the research chemical origin of what appeared to be a psychiatric emergency was not identified for days, sometimes longer, sometimes never. The misattribution matters, both for the individual's treatment and for the epidemiological picture of what research chemicals are actually doing to a college-age population. Campus naloxone programs have expanded significantly across American universities in recent years, driven partly by state laws requiring availability, and partly by the recognition that the overdose risk on campus has materially changed. Many universities now stock naloxone in residence hall first aid kits, campus health centres, and with resident advisors. The expansion is meaningful and has saved lives, but the behavioural dimensions of effective naloxone deployment are more complicated than the logistics of having the medication available. Students need to recognise an opioid overdose, slow, shallow breathing, unresponsiveness, blue lips, in a context where they may be intoxicated themselves, in a low-light environment, and where their first instinct may be to wait and see rather than to act. They need to know the naloxone is there, know how to use it, and be willing to use it before calling for additional help rather than waiting. Training programs that prepare students for this specific response exist and have been deployed on some campuses. They are not universal, and in a drug supply where a counterfeit Xanax can contain fentanyl, and where the person on the floor may have taken something they believed was a benzodiazepine, the range of scenarios in which campus naloxone might be needed has expanded well beyond what most training programs were designed to prepare students for. As of the mid-2020s, the research chemical crisis in the United States has not been solved. It has not even been contained exactly, though the shape of it has shifted. Some of the early synthetic cannabinoid and cathinone markets have been substantially disrupted by scheduling and enforcement action. The fentanyl and novel synthetic opioid crisis has, if anything, deepened, with the Xylazine adulterant problem, the nitazene emergence, and the ongoing proliferation of counterfeit pills creating new layers of complexity faster than the public health infrastructure can process them. The harm reduction movement has made meaningful gains in some jurisdictions, with naloxone more widely available than at any prior point in American history and fentanyl test strips decriminalized in a growing number of states. But the underlying structural problem, a legal and regulatory framework that moves more slowly than the chemistry it is trying to govern, combined with a global supply chain that is distributed, adaptive, and profit-driven, has not been fundamentally addressed. The people dying inside this crisis are real, their deaths are preventable, and the distance between what we know and what we are willing to do about it remains, as it has been for decades, one of the most consequential gaps in American public health. The overdose death statistics, which serve as the primary public benchmark for the severity of the crisis, have told a grim and consistent story for more than a decade. Annual drug overdose deaths in the United States, which stood at approximately 38,000 in 2010, crossed 100,000 for the first time in the 12-month period ending in April of 2021, driven overwhelmingly by synthetic opioids. That threshold, 100,000 deaths in a year, is a number that demands comparison. It is more Americans than die annually from gun violence and car accidents combined. It exceeds the American death toll in the entire Vietnam War, every single year, repeatedly. It is the equivalent of a mid-sized city vanishing from the map annually. and it is almost certainly an undercount, because the toxicology surveillance systems that produce these numbers are, as we've discussed at length, trailing behind the compounds they are trying to identify. The true number is higher. We do not know by how much. The political response to a crisis of this magnitude has been, by any reasonable measure, inadequate relative to the scale of the problem, though it has not been nothing. There has been significant federal funding directed at the opioid crisis, including billions of dollars from the settlements with pharmaceutical manufacturers that contributed to the prescribing practices of the early opioid epidemic. Treatment infrastructure has expanded. Buprenorphine prescribing was liberalized in 2023, removing a long-standing requirement that physicians obtain a special waiver to prescribe the medication, which had been one of the most significant structural barriers to treatment access. Naloxone became available over the counter nationally in 2023. Fentanyl test strips have been decriminalized in most states. The Mainstreaming Addiction Treatment Act reduced bureaucratic barriers to treating opioid use disorder in primary care settings. These are real achievements that have saved real lives. They are also achievements that arrived a decade or more into a crisis that had been clearly visible and clearly catastrophic the entire time. The research chemical dimension of the crisis, as distinct from the broader opioid crisis, though deeply intertwined with it, has received less focused policy attention than it deserves. The mechanisms that produce novel compounds introduce them into the drug supply and kill people before the regulatory system can respond have not been fundamentally addressed. The scheduling system remains compound-specific and reactive. The international supply chain from China and other manufacturing countries remains difficult to disrupt at scale. The information gap, the fact that people are routinely taking substances without knowing what those substances are, has not been closed, because the testing infrastructure that would close it is not universally available, and in many jurisdictions is not even legal. The forensic identification system that would tell us how many people are dying from novel compounds is underfunded and under-equipped. The treatment system, which has improved substantially for opioid use disorder, has no good options for people whose substance use involves the rotating cast of novel compounds that constitute the research chemical market, because you cannot develop evidence-based treatment protocols for substances that did not exist when the protocols were written. What a meaningful systemic response would look like is a question that people of genuine expertise and genuine good faith disagree about, and that disagreement is itself part of the problem. There is no consensus around which the political system can organize. The harm reduction community and the abstinence-oriented treatment community disagree about fundamentals. Law enforcement and public health researchers disagree about the relative value of enforcement versus services. Federalists and advocates for national standards disagree about the appropriate level at which policy should be made. These disagreements are real. They are not simply the result of bad faith or insufficient information, and they have produced a policy environment characterized more by incremental adjustment than by the kind of fundamental restructuring that the scale of the problem arguably demands. And in the background of all of it, the market continues. Right now, somewhere in a laboratory in eastern China, a chemist is working on something new. It will have a name derived from its molecular structure, a string of letters and numbers that means nothing to anyone without a chemistry degree. It will be synthesized in quantities measured in kilograms. It will be shipped in packages that pass through customs without being opened. It will be mixed into something else, or pressed into a pill, or sold directly to someone who believes they know what they're buying. Some of those people will be fine, some of them will not. The death will be recorded, if it is recorded at all, under a cause that may or may not accurately reflect what killed them. The scheduling process will eventually catch up, and then something else will come. This is the research chemical crisis as it actually exists. Not a dramatic emergency with a clear villain and a clear resolution, but a slow, grinding, structural failure a mismatch between the speed of chemistry, the speed of markets, and the speed of institutions that is killing people with the quiet persistence of something that nobody has quite figured out how to stop. The people who have died in it were real. They had names and families and lives that mattered. They did not choose to be test subjects for a market that had no obligation to protect them. And the distance between their deaths and the policy response that might have prevented them is not a technical distance. It is a political one. It is a cultural one. It is a distance measured in priorities and values, and what we decide as a society is worth the cost of closing. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet and let all of this slowly drift away, take a moment to sit with the weight of what we've covered. Because this wasn't a story about monsters or cartels or shadowy figures in laboratories, though all of those things are real and all of them are part of it. This was a story about a gap between how fast chemistry moves and how slowly institutions respond, a gap between what a label says and what a pill actually contains, a gap between the death that happened and the policy that might have prevented it, a gap that, for decades now, people have been falling through, real people with real names, real families, and real futures that ended quietly in bedrooms and bathrooms and emergency rooms across this country. The people at the centre of this crisis were not reckless. Many of them were not even knowingly taking risks. They were people who trusted that something legal was something safe. People who trusted that a pill that looked familiar was a pill they knew. People who had no idea that the supply chain between the substance in their hand and the laboratory that made it ran through a country they'd never visited, passed through a postal system that couldn't check everything, and arrived with a label that said one thing and meant another. They deserved better than that. And the quiet, stubborn truth is that we have the knowledge, the tools, and the capacity to give people better than that. We just haven't decided collectively that we will. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with at the end of a long day. And you don't have to solve it tonight. You're not required to fix it right now, in the dark, with your blanket pulled up and the fan running. But maybe carry just a little of it forward, a little of the weight of what these people's families carry every single day, a little of the clarity that comes from understanding something most people look away from. Because the first step toward closing a gap is being willing to look at it directly and say, this is real, this is happening, and it matters. The people who died in this crisis were someone's whole world, and the people working to stop it, the harm reduction workers handing out Naloxone in parking lots at midnight, the medical examiners, running tests on compounds they've never seen before, the parents standing in front of Congress with photographs of children who should still be alive. They're doing something quietly heroic in the middle of a crisis that most of America has learned not to look at too closely. History will remember this period. It will ask what we knew and when we knew it. The answer, it turns out, is that we knew quite a lot, quite early, and that the distance between knowledge and action was wider than it needed to be. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let the dark settle in gently around you, rest in the knowledge that understanding something is not nothing. Bearing witness to something is not nothing. And somewhere out there, someone is still alive because another person made a decision to carry Naloxone, to ask a question, to hand someone a test strip, to call for help without waiting, that did not make headlines and will never be counted in any statistic, but that mattered more than almost anything else that happened that day. Sleep well. The world is hard and the problems are real, but so are the people working on them. And tomorrow is another day to be one of those people, even in the smallest possible way. Good night.